Gunshots shattered the quiet afternoon air as Delilah Matthews urged her exhausted mare faster across the open plains of Kansas. Her 9-month-old son clutched desperately against her chest. 3 riders pursued her, their horses eating up the distance between them with each thundering hoofbeat. It was 1872, and the frontier town of Abilene was still 5 miles away, too far to reach before her horse gave out or the outlaws' bullets found their mark. "Give us what belongs to us, woman," shouted the lead rider, a man with a pockmarked face and cold, calculating eyes. The other 2 men flanked him, both raising their pistols to take aim at her fleeing form. Delilah's heart hammered in her chest as she bent low over her horse's neck. Her baby boy, Thomas, whimpered against her, somehow sensing the danger despite his tender age. She had nothing left in this world, except her son, and the small leather pouch containing evidence of her late husband's murder, evidence that would destroy the 3 men pursuing her if she could only reach the marshal in Abilene. "Please," she whispered to her mare, feeling the animal's labored breathing beneath her. "Just a little further." The sound of another horse approaching from the east made her head snap up. Through tear-blurred vision, she saw a lone rider galloping toward them on a powerful black stallion, kicking up dust as he closed the distance. For a moment, hope died in her chest. A 4th outlaw joining the chase would seal her fate. But as the rider drew near, she saw he wasn't riding with the outlaws. He was racing toward them, his face set in determination under the brim of his hat. The man's eyes locked with hers across the distance, and something passed between them, a promise. "Hold on," he shouted over the thunder of hooves. The newcomer spurred his horse harder, the magnificent stallion surging forward with renewed strength. As he approached, Delilah could see he wore no badge, but there was something about him, a quiet authority in his bearing, a steadiness in his gaze that offered her the first glimmer of hope since her desperate flight began. In one fluid motion, the stranger drew his revolver and fired 2 precise shots. One of the outlaws cried out as a bullet struck his shoulder, causing him to reel back in his saddle. The other shots kicked up dirt at the hooves of the pursuers' horses, momentarily forcing them to scatter. The man urged his stallion alongside Delilah's faltering mare. "Your horse won't make it. Take my hand." Delilah hesitated for only a fraction of a second before reaching out with her free arm, her other clutching Thomas protectively. The stranger's strong grip closed around her wrist, and with one powerful movement, he pulled her and the baby from her saddle onto his own. "Hold tight," he commanded, his voice deep and steady in her ear as she settled in front of him, his arm secure around her waist. The black stallion barely faltered under the additional weight, its powerful muscles driving forward as the man turned the horse sharply west, away from both the outlaws and the direct path to Abilene. "But the town," Delilah began, clutching her baby tighter. "They'll expect that," he cut in, guiding his horse toward a line of trees that marked a creek bed in the distance. "I know these lands. There's another way." Bullets whizzed past them, but the stranger's horse was fresh and strong, gradually increasing the distance between them and their pursuers. "Name's Ethan Hayes," the man said as they rode, his breath warm against her hair. "And I reckon you've got quite a story to tell." Delilah's throat tightened as she pressed her son closer to her chest. "Delilah Matthews, and this is Thomas." Her voice broke as she added, "They killed my husband." Ethan's arm tightened protectively around her waist. "Well, Mrs. Matthews, I promise you this, they won't be hurting either of you today." As they thundered toward the safety of the tree line, Delilah felt the steady beat of Ethan's heart against her back, strong and reassuring. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that she and her son might survive after all. The black stallion plunged into the shallow creek, water spraying up around them as Ethan guided the horse downstream, using the water to hide their tracks. The coolness of the water contrasted with the warmth of the man behind her, his presence solid and secure. The sound of pursuit grew fainter as they followed the winding creek bed, eventually emerging onto a game trail that led through a dense stand of cottonwoods. "My husband, Robert, was a banker in Caldwell," Delilah explained as they rode, her voice barely audible above the sound of hoofbeats and rustling leaves. "He discovered something discrepancies in the accounts of some powerful men. When he threatened to expose them, She trailed off, unable to finish. "The tall one with the scar, that's Victor Donovan," Ethan said grimly. "I recognize him and his boys. They work for Harrison Styles, owns half the businesses between here and Wichita." Delilah nodded, not surprised. "Robert kept evidence documents showing how they've been stealing from honest folks, laundering money from rustling operations. I took everything when I fled." She patted the leather pouch secured inside her dress. "I just need to get it to Marshall Parker in Abilene." Ethan guided his horse up a steep embankment, emerging onto a ridge that gave them a view of the surrounding countryside. In the distance, they could see their pursuers milling about, clearly having lost their trail. "We'll rest here a moment," Ethan said, helping Delilah down from the saddle. His hands lingered at her waist longer than necessary, steadying her on legs that had gone numb from riding. Their eyes met, and something flickered between them, recognition, perhaps of kindred spirits who understood loss. Thomas stirred against Delilah's chest, making small fussing sounds. "He's hungry," she explained, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I haven't been able to stop long enough to feed him properly." "There's a small homestead about 2 miles from here," Ethan said, turning to give her privacy while keeping watch on the horizon. "Belongs to friends of mine. We can rest there, get supplies before continuing to Abilene by a back route." Delilah settled against a tree trunk, adjusting her clothing to feed her son. "You saved our lives back there, Mr. Hayes. Why would you risk yourself for strangers?" Ethan's shoulders tensed slightly before he answered. "Let's just say I've seen enough good folks suffer at the hands of men like Donovan." He paused, then added more softly, "And it's just Ethan, madam." As Thomas nursed, Delilah studied the man who had come to their rescue. Ethan Hayes stood tall, his broad shoulders outlined against the afternoon sky. His clothes were worn but clean, faded denim pants, a blue cotton shirt open at the collar revealing sun-bronzed skin, and a leather vest. His dark brown hair curled slightly where it met the collar of his shirt, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his strong jaw. But it was his eyes that held her attention, deep green eyes that seemed to hold secrets of their own. "You're not from around here," she observed, noting his accent wasn't purely Western. A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Originally from Virginia. Came west after the war." The smile faded. "Found there wasn't much left for me back east." The simple statement contained volumes of unspoken pain, and Delilah felt a surge of connection to this stranger who had risked his life for her and Thomas. They had both lost something, perhaps everything, and yet here they were, still fighting. When Thomas finished nursing, Ethan helped Delilah back onto his horse. This time, she settled behind him, one arm wrapped around his waist while the other secured Thomas in a sling across her chest. The closeness felt both inappropriate and necessary, a reminder of how quickly circumstances had forced intimacy upon them. They rode in comfortable silence for a time, the rhythm of the horse's gait lulling Thomas to sleep. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie, painting the landscape in gold and amber. Despite the beauty surrounding them, Delilah remained acutely aware of the danger still pursuing them. "You think they'll find us?" she asked quietly. Ethan's voice was steady when he replied. "They'll try. Men like that don't give up easily when there's evidence that could hang them." He glanced back at her, his expression softening when he saw the worry etched on her face. "But I know this land better than they do, and I've got friends in these parts. We'll get you and your boy to safety." Something in his tone made Delilah believe him, despite all logic suggesting their situation was still perilous. Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps it was something about Ethan Hayes himself, a quiet competence that inspired confidence. As the sun began to set, they approached a small homestead nestled in a protected valley. Smoke curled from the chimney of a modest cabin, and a well-tended garden stretched along one side. A weathered barn stood nearby, and chickens scratched in the yard. "This is the Morgan place," Ethan explained as they approached. "Samuel and Martha Morgan, good people. Samuel fought with me during the war." Before they reached the cabin door, it swung open to reveal an older woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes. She took one look at them and called over her shoulder, "Sam, Ethan's here and he's brought company." Martha Morgan ushered them inside with no questions asked, her experienced eyes taking in Delilah's exhausted state and the sleeping baby. "Land sakes, child, you look like you've ridden through hell itself," she said, guiding Delilah to a chair near the fire. "Let me take that little one while you catch your breath." Before Delilah could protest, Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Martha raised 6 children of her own. Your boy is in good hands." Samuel Morgan emerged from the back room, a tall man with a slight limp and weathered features that broke into a smile at the sight of Ethan. "Hayes, you old war dog," he greeted, clasping Ethan's hand. "Trouble follows you like a shadow, doesn't it?" "Not by choice, Sam," Ethan replied with a weary smile. He quickly explained their situation while Martha prepared a simple but hearty meal of stew and cornbread. Samuel's expression grew serious as he listened. "Stiles and his bunch have been getting bolder. Just last month, they ran the Peterson family off their claim land that happened to have a new silver vein running through it." He shook his head in disgust. "Marshall and Abilene's been trying to build a case, but witnesses have a way of disappearing. Or being silenced permanently," Ethan added grimly. Delilah's hands trembled slightly as she accepted a bowl of stew from Martha. "My husband tried to do what was right. He believed in justice." Her voice caught. "He never thought they'd actually kill him for it." Martha sat beside her, placing a comforting hand over Delilah's. "Men like that don't see the world the way decent folks do, dear. They see only power and how to get more of it." As they ate, plans were made. Samuel would ride to a neighboring farm to spread word among trusted friends to watch for Donovan and his men. Martha prepared a bundle of supplies, food, clean clothes for both Delilah and the baby, and a small bottle of laudanum, just in case. "The back trail to Abilene will take you past the old mission," Samuel explained, pointing to a rough map he'd drawn. "It's longer but less traveled. You should be able to reach town by midday tomorrow if you leave before first light." After the meal, Martha showed Delilah to a small bedroom where she could wash and change. The simple luxury of clean clothes and warm water to wash away the dust of the trail brought tears to Delilah's eyes. When she emerged, feeling somewhat restored, she found Ethan sitting alone by the fire, Thomas cradled carefully in his arms. The sight stopped her in the doorway, this strong, capable man holding her son with such gentle care. Thomas was awake, his tiny hand wrapped around one of Ethan's fingers as the man spoke to him in low, soothing tones. "You're a natural with him," Delilah said softly, approaching to sit beside them. Ethan looked up, a flash of vulnerability crossing his face before he masked it. "My sister had little ones before." He stopped, then simply said, "It's been a while." Delilah sensed another loss, another piece of his past that had shaped him but didn't press. Instead, she reached for her son, their fingers brushing as Ethan carefully transferred the baby to her arms. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes. "Not just for saving us today, but for—" She struggled to articulate all he'd done. "For being kind, for helping us when you had no obligation to." Ethan's gaze held hers, something unspoken passing between them. "Some obligations don't need badges or blood ties, Mrs. Matthews. Sometimes you just know what's right." Later that night, as Delilah lay in the small guest bed with Thomas sleeping beside her, she found herself thinking of Ethan Hayes, of his strength and his gentleness, of the pain she glimpsed behind his eyes that mirrored her own. Outside her window, she could hear the soft murmur of men's voices as Ethan and Samuel kept watch, guarding against the danger that still pursued them. For the first time since Robert's murder, Delilah allowed herself to feel something beyond grief and fear. It was a dangerous feeling, a foolish one perhaps, this tentative trust in a stranger who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to voice. Yet as sleep finally claimed her, she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her chest at the thought of riding beside him again tomorrow, his arms steady around her, guiding them toward safety. Dawn broke misty and cool over the Morgan homestead as Ethan saddled his horse, securing the provisions Martha had prepared in his saddlebags. He'd spent the night alternating watches with Samuel, alert to any sign of pursuit, but the night had passed quietly. Too quietly, perhaps. Men like Donovan didn't give up easily, especially when their necks were potentially on the line. The cabin door opened, and Delilah stepped out, Thomas bundled securely against her chest. She wore a simple blue calico dress Martha had provided, slightly too large but clean and serviceable. Her honey-brown hair was neatly braided, and some color had returned to her cheeks after a night of proper rest. Something tightened in Ethan's chest at the sight of her, a feeling he hadn't expected and wasn't entirely comfortable with. "You look rested," he said, immediately regretting how inadequate the words sounded. A small smile touched her lips. Amazing what a real bed and safety can do. She approached the horse, her expression growing serious. "You think we lost them?" Ethan checked the cinch on his saddle before answering. "For now, maybe. But they'll have riders checking all the routes to Abilene. Our best chance is still the back trail through the Mission lands." Samuel emerged from the barn carrying a rifle. "Take this," he said, handing it to Ethan. "Extra ammunition's in the saddlebag." Martha followed, pressing a small bundle into Delilah's hands. "Some extra things for the baby," she explained, "and a little something for yourself." She embraced the younger woman warmly. "You be strong now. That little one needs his mama to be brave." Ethan helped Delilah mount, then swung up behind her. This time, she settled naturally against him, her body fitting against his as if they'd ridden together many times before. Thomas, secure in his improvised sling, made soft cooing sounds, seemingly content despite their circumstances. "We'll send word once we reach Abilene," Ethan promised his friends. Samuel nodded grimly. "Godspeed. We'll keep eyes out for trouble." They set off just as the sun cleared the horizon, following a narrow trail that wound through a stand of cottonwoods before emerging onto the open prairie. Ethan kept to low ground where possible, using the land to shield their movement from distant observers. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of wildflowers and sage. "Tell me about your husband," Ethan said after they'd ridden in silence for some time. "If you don't mind speaking of him." Delilah stiffened slightly before relaxing against him once more. Robert was a good man, she began, her voice soft with remembrance. Methodical, honest to a fault. We met in St. Louis where my father was a professor at the university. Robert had ambitions of building a life in the West, helping to establish proper banking in frontier towns. She paused, absently stroking Thomas's head. We'd been in Caldwell for just over a year when he discovered discrepancies in accounts connected to Harrison Styles. Loans that were never repaid, collateral that disappeared, money moving between accounts in ways that made no sense unless you were laundering funds from illegal activities. And he confronted Styles, Ethan asked, already knowing the answer. Not directly. Robert believed in doing things properly. He compiled evidence, prepared to take it to the territorial authorities. Her voice caught. The night before he was to leave for Topeka, men came to our home. I was visiting a neighbor with Thomas. When I returned, Ethan's arm tightened instinctively around her waist. You don't need to say more. She shook her head. No, I want to. They'd made it look like a robbery gone wrong, but I knew better. Robert had told me where he hid his evidence in case anything happened to him. I took it and ran that same night. I've been moving from place to place for 3 weeks, trying to reach someone who could help. Every time I thought I was safe, they found me. How did they track you to that stretch of prairie where I found you? Ethan asked, the tactical part of his mind still working through the details. I trusted the wrong person in Council Grove, she admitted. A woman who ran a boarding house. I thought she was helping me, but she must have sent word to Donovan. Ethan nodded, pieces falling into place. Styles has people in most towns around here, paid informants, business partners with vested interests. That's why Abilene might be different. Marshall Parker has been working to clean up the town since the railroad came through. He's one of the few lawmen I'd trust with what you're carrying. They rode in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and warming the air around them. In the distance, they could see the crumbling walls of the old mission. Samuel had mentioned a relic from earlier days when Spanish priests had attempted to convert the native populations. What about you? Delilah asked eventually. You mentioned Virginia and the war. Were you an officer? Ethan's past wasn't something he discussed often, but something about Delilah's quiet strength made him want to share parts of himself he usually kept hidden. Captain, Virginia Infantry, he replied. Fought from First Bull Run to Appomattox. The memories rose unbidden, the thunder of artillery, the screams of men and horses, the sickly sweet smell of death that permeated everything. Lost my younger brother at Gettysburg. Father died of consumption while I was away. Our family home was burned during Sheridan's campaign. I'm sorry, Delilah said simply, her hand covering his where it rested at her waist. After the surrender, there wasn't much to go back to. Came west looking for something new, I suppose. He hesitated, then added, rode with a ranch outfit in Texas for a while, then drifted north. Been working odd jobs, helping the marshal in Abilene sometimes when he needs an extra gun. Is that how you knew to help me? You saw my pursuers and recognized them as outlaws. Ethan guided his horse around a rocky outcropping before answering. I was actually heading to the Morgan place when I saw the chase, something about a woman fleeing with a child. He didn't complete the thought. Delilah turned slightly, looking up at him with eyes that seemed to see too much. There's more to your story than you're telling. His jaw tightened. There's always more to every story, Mrs. Matthews. Delilah, she corrected softly. After all we've been through, I think you've earned the right to use my given name. The simple request broke through a wall Ethan hadn't realized he'd built. Delilah, he repeated, her name feeling right on his tongue. They reached the mission by midday, stopping in the shade of its crumbling walls to rest the horse and eat some of the food Martha had packed. The ancient building stood like a sentinel on a small rise, offering a view of the surrounding prairie. From this vantage point, they could see for miles in every direction, including the faint dust cloud that indicated riders approaching from the south. "Donovan," Ethan said grimly, counting at least 5 distinct riders through his field glass. "They must have picked up our trail somehow." Delilah clutched Thomas closer, her face paling. "How? We were so careful. Someone at one of the farms near the Morgans must have talked." Ethan quickly packed their supplies, his mind racing through options. "We can't outrun them, not with the 3 of us on one horse, and we still have at least 4 hours' ride to Abilene." The mission itself offered little protection, its roof long gone, its walls partially collapsed from years of neglect. But as Ethan scanned their surroundings, he noticed something that might give them an advantage. "There," he pointed to a narrow ravine that cut through the prairie about half a mile east of the mission. "That leads to the river. If we can reach it, we might be able to lose them in the wooded bottomland." They mounted quickly, Ethan pushing his horse harder than he would have liked. The animal responded gallantly, sensing the urgency in its rider's commands. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the ravine when a shot rang out, the bullet kicking up dirt just yards ahead of them. Ethan swore under his breath. "They've spotted us." He changed direction abruptly, cutting directly toward the ravine rather than circling to its mouth. It would mean a steeper descent, but they had no choice. Behind them, the riders were gaining ground, spreading out to cut off potential escape routes. "Hold tight," he instructed Delilah, feeling her arms tighten around his waist as he urged his horse toward the edge of the ravine. The descent was treacherous, loose shale, and steep drop-offs threatened to send them tumbling with each step. Ethan let his horse pick its way down, trusting the animal's instincts while he kept one eye on the ridge above where their pursuers had appeared. More shots rang out, but the angles were poor from the pursuers' position, and the bullets struck harmlessly against rock faces. About halfway down, they reached a narrow ledge that offered some protection from above. Ethan dismounted quickly, helping Delilah and Thomas down. "Stay here," he said, drawing his revolver and the rifle Samuel had provided. "I'll try to discourage them from following too closely." "Be careful," Delilah whispered, pressing herself against the ravine wall with Thomas held protectively against her chest. Ethan positioned himself at the edge of the ledge, using a boulder for cover. He took careful aim at the nearest rider and fired. The man jerked in his saddle but didn't fall. A second shot caused the riders to scatter, seeking cover among the rocks at the ravine's edge. For several tense minutes, an exchange of gunfire echoed through the ravine. Ethan managed to hit one of the outlaws in the leg, sending him scrambling back from the edge. But he knew they were in a precarious position, outnumbered and with limited ammunition. "We need to keep moving," he said during a lull in the firing. "They'll try to find another way down or circle around to the mouth of the ravine." Delilah nodded grimly, her face set with determination despite the fear in her eyes. Ethan helped her back onto the horse, then led the animal on foot down the remainder of the slope, careful to stay under the overhanging rock as much as possible to shield them from gunfire from above. When they reached the bottom of the ravine, they found themselves in a narrow stream bed that wound its way eastward. Bare cottonwood trees lined the banks, their branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. The water was shallow this time of year, barely covering the rocky bottom in most places. Ethan mounted behind Delilah once more, and they followed the stream bed, the sound of water beneath their horses' hooves masking the noise of their passage. The high walls of the ravine gradually lowered as they progressed, eventually opening into a broader floodplain thick with trees and underbrush. "We should have some cover here," Ethan said, guiding his horse into a dense thicket of willows. "But they'll be coming. We need to find a place to make a stand or figure out how to slip past them to reach Abilene." Delilah turned to face him, her expression resolute despite the danger surrounding them. "I won't let Thomas grow up an orphan, Ethan. I can't let these men take both his parents from him." Something in her words struck Ethan deeply, perhaps the quiet courage behind them, or the reminder of what was truly at stake. This wasn't just about bringing criminals to justice. It was about a mother fighting for her child's future. "I promise you," he said, his voice low and fierce, "that boy will not lose his mother today." Their eyes locked, and in that moment, something changed between them, a shift as subtle and significant as the turning of a key in a lock. Despite the danger, despite the inappropriate timing, Ethan found himself acutely aware of her proximity, of the trust in her eyes, of the inexplicable connection that had formed between them in less than a day. A shout from upstream broke the moment. Donovan and his men had found the ravine's entrance and were following their trail. Ethan quickly guided his horse deeper into the woods, away from the stream, hoping the thick undergrowth would hide their tracks. They traveled in tense silence for nearly an hour, stopping occasionally to listen for pursuit. The wooded bottomland gradually gave way to more open country, rolling hills dotted with stands of oak and elm. Abilene was still a good distance away, but they were at least moving in the right direction. As they crested a small rise, Ethan spotted a weathered structure in the distance, an old line shack, probably used by cowboys during cattle drives in earlier years. It stood alone on the prairie, its timbers gray with age. "We could rest there," he suggested, noting how Delilah's shoulders had begun to slump with fatigue. "The horse needs water, and we could all use a brief respite." Delilah nodded gratefully. Thomas had been remarkably quiet throughout their flight, but now he was beginning to fuss, making small whimpering sounds that indicated he would soon demand more substantial attention. The line shack proved to be more substantial than it appeared from a distance. Though dusty and long abandoned, its roof was intact, and its single room offered shelter from both elements and prying eyes. A small spring bubbled up nearby, providing fresh water for both them and the horse. While Ethan tended to his stallion, Delilah settled inside the shack to feed Thomas. When Ethan returned, he found her seated on an old wooden crate, the baby nursing contentedly at her breast, partially covered by a light blanket from Martha's provisions. "Sorry," he muttered, turning to leave. "It's all right," Delilah said softly. "You've seen worse sights than a mother feeding her child, I imagine." Ethan remained in the doorway, his back to her out of respect. "How long before he finishes? We shouldn't stay in one place too long. Just a few more minutes." There was a pause, then she added, "Ethan, I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm grateful for what you've done. Few men would have risked themselves for strangers the way you have." He shook his head, still facing the doorway. "Don't thank me yet. We're still a long way from safe." Nevertheless, her words were cut short by the distant sound of hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching from the direction they had come. Ethan moved swiftly to the window, peering cautiously through the grimy glass. "Donovan and 3 others," he confirmed grimly. "They must have seen the shack from a distance." Delilah rose quickly, adjusting her clothing and securing Thomas in his sling. "What do we do?" Ethan assessed their options rapidly. The shack offered some protection, but they would be trapped inside if the outlaws surrounded it. Making a run for it across open country would leave them exposed. Neither choice was good. "Get down behind that old table," he instructed, moving to the other window to gauge distances and angles. I'll try to hold them off as long as possible. And then what? Delilah asked, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. Ethan checked his weapons. The revolver had 4 rounds remaining, the rifle perhaps a dozen. Not enough for an extended gunfight against 4 determined men. Then we improvise, he said with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. The riders were approaching cautiously, having spotted the horse tethered near the spring. They spread out, circling the shack from a distance. "Matthew's woman," Donovan's voice carried across the prairie. "We know you're in there. Send out those papers and maybe we'll let you live." Ethan positioned himself at the window, rifle ready. "Stay down," he whispered to Delilah, who had taken shelter behind the overturned table. Thomas clutched protectively against her chest. "We've got you surrounded," Donovan continued. "There's no way out this time." In response, Ethan fired a single shot, striking the ground near Donovan's horse, causing the animal to rear in alarm. "That's your answer," Ethan called back. "Next one won't miss." A fusillade of gunfire erupted from the Outlaws, bullets splintering the wooden walls of the shack. Ethan ducked down, covering his head as glass shattered and wood fragments flew around the room. "You all right?" he called to Delilah when the firing paused. "We're okay," she replied, though her voice trembled slightly. Thomas had begun to cry, frightened by the noise of gunfire. Ethan risked a glance through the broken window. The Outlaws had taken cover behind rocks in a small rise about 100 yards from the shack. They were effectively pinned down, but so were their quarry. "Hayes," Donovan shouted. "That's you in there, isn't it? This ain't your fight, man. The woman's got stolen property papers that belong to Mr. Stiles. Walk away from this, and there's good money waiting for you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Those papers document how Stiles and his men have been stealing from honest folks and murdering those who stand in their way," he shouted back. "Including this woman's husband. Don't be a fool," Donovan called. "Stiles owns half the territory. You think some marshal in Abilene is going to bring him down? Even if you make it there, which you won't, nothing will come of it except more bodies in the ground." Ethan turned to Delilah, who was attempting to quiet Thomas's cries. "He's trying to buy time," he said in a low voice. "They're probably working out how to flank us." She nodded, her face pale but composed. "What can we do?" Ethan glanced around the shack, his mind working rapidly. There was a back window, partially obscured by an old cupboard, and beneath the loose floorboards where Delilah sat. "Is that a root cellar?" he asked, noticing a metal ring partially visible through the gaps in the planking. Together, they moved the table aside and lifted the trapdoor, revealing a small storage space below, not much more than a hole dug in the earth with rough timber shoring, but it might serve their purpose. "I have an idea," Ethan said, quickly outlining his plan. Minutes later, as the Outlaws began another round of shooting, Ethan fired back strategically. Conserving ammunition while making it appear, he was positioned near the front window. Delilah, meanwhile, had descended into the root cellar with Thomas, taking only the essential supplies and the precious documents. When the firing paused again, Ethan made his move. He quickly slid the cupboard away from the rear window and climbed through, staying low and using the shack itself as cover. From this position, he made his way to where his horse was tethered. The black stallion nickered softly as Ethan approached. "Quiet boy," he murmured, leading the animal carefully around to the back of the shack. Using hand signals he'd arranged with Delilah, he indicated when she should emerge from the root cellar. She appeared moments later, Thomas secured tightly against her, and Ethan helped them both onto the horse. With practiced stealth, he led the animal away from the shack, using a shallow depression in the land to shield their movement from the Outlaws still focused on the front of the building. They had covered perhaps 50 yards when a shout went up. They're getting away out the back. Ethan swung into the saddle behind Delilah and spurred his horse forward. The stallion leapt ahead, powerful muscles driving them across the open ground toward a distant line of trees. Behind them, Donovan and his men scrambled for their horses, precious minutes lost in their confusion. "They'll follow," Ethan said grimly as they galloped across the prairie. "But we've got a head start and my horse is stronger than theirs." Delilah leaned back against him, one hand steadying Thomas, the other gripping the saddle horn. "How far to Abilene now?" "Less than 2 hours' ride if we can maintain this pace," Ethan replied, guiding his horse toward a stand of trees that would provide temporary cover. The afternoon wore on as they rode hard across the Kansas prairie, alternating between galloping across open ground and moving more carefully through wooded areas to throw off pursuit. Twice, they caught glimpses of their pursuers in the distance, but each time managed to increase their lead through Ethan's knowledge of the terrain. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the outskirts of Abilene came into view, a scatter of buildings that gradually coalesced into a proper town. As they approached, the railroad tracks gleamed in the late afternoon light, a symbol of the progress and change that had transformed this once quiet cattle town. "We're almost there," Ethan said, feeling Delilah's body relax slightly against his. "Marshal Parker's office is near the central square. Once we reach him, you'll be under official protection." But as they entered the town limits, Ethan's instincts prickled with warning. The streets were unusually quiet for this time of day, with few pedestrians visible, and several businesses already shuttered despite the early hour. "Something's not right," he murmured, slowing their pace and scanning the surroundings carefully. They had just turned onto the main street when a shot rang out, the bullet striking a wooden post just inches from them. Ethan immediately wheeled his horse around, pulling them into the shelter of an alleyway as more gunfire erupted. "They got here ahead of us," he realized, dismounting quickly and helping Delilah down. "Must have sent a rider directly to town while the others chased us." Delilah's face was ashen, but her voice remained steady. "What now? We're so close." Ethan tied his horse securely in the alley. "We'll have to proceed on foot, stay to the back streets. Parker's office is just 2 blocks from here." With Thomas secured in his sling and Ethan leading the way, they moved cautiously through the network of alleys and service passages behind Abilene's main businesses. The sound of normal activity piano music from a saloon, the clatter of dishes from a restaurant kitchen created an eerie contrast to the danger they knew lurked in the streets. They were within sight of the marshal's office when 2 men stepped out from a doorway ahead, blocking their path. Both held revolvers pointed directly at them. "That's far enough," said the taller of the two, a lean man with a face pitted by smallpox scars. Ethan pushed Delilah behind him, his hand moving toward his own weapon. "You're making a mistake, friend." "No mistake," the man replied coldly. "Styles pays well for problems to disappear. Nothing personal." In the moment before violence erupted, time seemed to slow for Ethan. He was acutely aware of Delilah's presence behind him, of Thomas's tiny life depending on his next actions, of the weight of his revolver at his side and the distance to the nearest cover. The gunman's finger tightened on the trigger, but Ethan moved first. He drew and fired in one fluid motion, decades of survival instinct guiding his hand. The first man fell backward, a look of surprise frozen on his face. The second managed to get off a shot that grazed Ethan's left arm before a second bullet from Ethan's gun found its mark. "Run!" Ethan urged Delilah, the sound of their confrontation already drawing attention. They sprinted the remaining distance to the marshal's office, bursting through the door to find a startled deputy rising from behind a desk. "Where's Parker?" Ethan demanded, recognizing the young man as one of the marshal's deputies. "Out at the Miller place," the deputy responded, his hand hovering uncertainly near his sidearm. "There was trouble. Listen carefully," Ethan cut in. "This woman has evidence against Harrison Stiles and his operation. Her husband was murdered for it, and Stiles's men are in town right now trying to kill her and her child. We need protection until Parker returns." The deputy's eyes widened. "Stiles? But he's a criminal," Delilah interjected firmly, stepping forward, "and I can prove it." She withdrew the leather pouch from inside her dress and placed it on the desk. "Banking records, witness statements, details of illegal operations across 3 counties, all authenticated. My husband gave his life to compile this evidence." The deputy Jenkins, according to the nameplate on the desk, swallowed hard, clearly struggling with the magnitude of the situation thrust upon him. "Deputy," Ethan said, his voice low and intense, "I know you're in over your head here. But right now, you need to make a choice about what kind of lawman you want to be." Something in Ethan's words seemed to reach the young man. He squared his shoulders and nodded. "Back room," he said decisively. "It's secure, only one entrance, and the windows are barred. I'll send a rider for the marshal right away." As Jenkins hurried out, leaving another deputy to guard the front office, Ethan helped Delilah into the back room. It was sparsely furnished: a cot, a small table with 2 chairs, and a washstand. But the heavy door and barred windows offered security they desperately needed. "Let me see your arm," Delilah said once they were alone, noticing the bloodstains spreading on Ethan's sleeve. "It's just a graze," he tried to dismiss, but she was already guiding him to sit on the cot. "Please," she said softly, "let me help you for a change." Using water from the washstand and strips torn from a clean towel, Delilah cleaned and bandaged the wound with gentle efficiency. Her fingers worked deftly, and Ethan found himself watching her face as she concentrated on the task: the slight furrow between her brows, the way she caught her lower lip between her teeth, the tenderness in her touch. "You've done this before," he observed. A sad smile touched her lips. "Robert was always coming home with cuts and scrapes from his building projects. He had grand ideas about improving our little house." The intimacy of the moment, her hands on his skin, the shared danger they'd survived, the quiet vulnerability in her voice as she spoke of her husband, created a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. "I'm sorry about your husband," Ethan said quietly. "He sounds like a good man." "He was." Delilah secured the bandage and stepped back slightly. "Thomas has his eyes. Sometimes when I look at my son, I see glimpses of his father." Thomas, as if sensing he was being discussed, made a soft cooing sound from his makeshift bed on a folded blanket nearby. Both adults turned to look at the baby, finding momentary peace in his innocent presence. "What will you do?" Ethan asked after a moment. "After this is over, I mean." Delilah sank into one of the chairs, suddenly looking very tired. "I don't know. I can't go back to Caldwell. Too many memories, too many of Stiles's people. Perhaps St. Louis, where my parents lived before they passed." Ethan nodded, understanding the need for a fresh start. He'd been seeking one himself since the war ended, drifting from place to place without finding anywhere that felt like home. "What about you?" Delilah asked, her eyes meeting his. "Will you stay in Abilene?" Before Ethan could answer, shouting erupted from the front office. Both tensed, Ethan reaching for his gun while positioning himself between Delilah and the door. The door burst open to reveal Deputy Jenkins, his face flushed with excitement. "Marshall's back," he announced, "and he's brought company federal marshals from Topeka. They've been building a case against Stiles for months." Relief washed over Delilah's face as she clutched Thomas to her chest. Ethan felt his own tension ease, though he remained vigilant until Marshal Parker himself appeared in the doorway. Parker was a burly man with a salt and pepper beard and the weathered face of someone who had seen his share of frontier justice. His eyes narrowed when he spotted Ethan. "Hayes," he acknowledged with a nod. "Should have known you'd be in the middle of this mess." "Not by choice this time," Ethan replied with a tired smile. Parker turned his attention to Delilah. "Mrs. Matthews, I believe you have something that might interest our federal friends." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Delilah presented her evidence to the federal marshals, who combined it with information they had already gathered. Arrest warrants were issued not just for Donovan and his men, but for Harrison Stiles himself, and several prominent businessmen associated with his operations. By nightfall, word spread throughout Abilene that Stiles's empire was crumbling. 3 of Donovan's men had been captured trying to flee town, though Donovan himself remained at large. Federal marshals had ridden for Wichita to arrest Stiles at his main residence. Ethan and Delilah, exhausted from their ordeal, were provided rooms at the Grand Hotel under the protection of deputies stationed in the hallway. After ensuring Delilah and Thomas were safely settled, Ethan retreated to his own room, the events of the past 2 days catching up with him all at once. He had just removed his boots and was contemplating the luxury of a proper bed when a soft knock sounded at his door. Opening it cautiously, he found Delilah standing in the hallway, Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said hesitantly. I wanted to check on your wound, and to thank you properly." Ethan stepped aside to let her enter, suddenly acutely aware of the impropriety of the situation, a widow alone in a man's hotel room, even with a child present. But after everything they'd been through together, conventional social boundaries seemed somehow less important. "How's the arm?" she asked, setting Thomas down carefully on a cushioned chair, arranging blankets around him to prevent him from rolling. "Better, thanks to your tending," Ethan replied, flexing the limb to demonstrate. Delilah approached him, her eyes searching his face. "You saved our lives today. Without you, Thomas and I would be—" She couldn't finish the thought. "You're a remarkable woman, Delilah Matthews," Ethan said quietly. "You protected your child and your husband's legacy with more courage than most men I've known. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." "It was more than that," she insisted, stepping closer. "You could have ridden on. You could have taken Stiles's money when he offered it. You could have left us at any point along the way, but you didn't. You stayed, and you fought for us for people you didn't even know." Ethan found himself unable to respond, moved by the sincerity in her voice and the intensity in her eyes. Something had been building between them throughout their journey, something unexpected and perhaps unwise, but undeniable nonetheless. "I lost everything once," he finally said. "After the war, I wandered for years, trying to find something worth fighting for again. Today, when I saw you on that prairie with your son, running for your lives." He paused, searching for words to express what he barely understood himself. "Something just felt right about standing between you and harm." Delilah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. And now, with the danger past, Ethan's heart pounded as he recognized the question behind her words. It was too soon, too complicated, too fraught with potential for regret. She was still grieving her husband, still processing the trauma of his murder and their flight. He was still carrying his own ghosts, still uncertain of his place in the world, and yet, "I still want to stand with you," he admitted softly. "Not between you and danger, but beside you if you'll allow it. Not today or tomorrow, perhaps, but someday when you're ready." A single tear slipped down Delilah's cheek. "I don't know when that will be," she whispered. "Robert's memory is still so fresh, and Thomas needs stability after everything that's happened." "I understand," Ethan said, resisting the urge to wipe away her tear. "And I'll respect whatever decision you make. If you choose to go to St. Louis or anywhere else, I'll help you get there safely." Delilah stepped forward and with gentle determination placed her hand against his cheek. "And if I decide to stay in Kansas, to build a new life here?" The question hung in the air between them, filled with possibility. Ethan covered her hand with his own, allowing himself to imagine a future he hadn't dared consider before. "Then I'd be honored to help you build it," he said simply. In the quiet of the hotel room, with Thomas sleeping peacefully nearby, something fragile and precious took root between them. Not love, not yet, but the promise of it. A beginning built on shared courage and mutual respect, with time for grief to heal and trust to deepen naturally. Delilah smiled through her tears, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time since Ethan had met her. "I think I'd like that," she said softly. The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains of the hotel dining room as Ethan finished his breakfast. 1 week had passed since their arrival in Abilene, and the town was still buzzing with the aftermath of Harrison Stiles's arrest. Federal marshals had seized assets across 3 counties, and numerous accomplices had been taken into custody. Only Victor Donovan remained at large, having apparently fled the territory entirely. Ethan glanced at the newspaper beside his plate, which featured a front-page story about the case. Delilah's testimony had been crucial, the article noted, though it respectfully omitted her name to protect her privacy. Robert Matthews was mentioned as a hero whose diligent work had exposed a criminal enterprise that had terrorized the region for years. "More coffee, Mr. Hayes?" asked a waitress, interrupting his thoughts. "No, thank you," he replied, setting aside his cup. "Has Mrs. Matthews come down yet this morning?" "About an hour ago, sir. She took the baby for a walk, afterwards said something about visiting the marshal's office." Ethan nodded his thanks and settled his bill before stepping out into the bright morning air. Abilene was coming alive with activity, freight wagons rumbling down the streets, merchants opening their shops, the distant whistle of a train approaching the station. He found Delilah where he expected, seated on a bench outside the marshal's office, Thomas balanced on her knee. The baby had grown noticeably more alert in the week since their ordeal, his curious eyes taking in the bustling town around him. "Good morning," Ethan greeted, tipping his hat as he approached. Delilah looked up, her face brightening. "Good morning. Thomas and I were just discussing our future plans, weren't we, little one?" She bounced the baby gently, eliciting a happy gurgle. "And have you reached any conclusions?" Ethan asked, settling beside her on the bench. "As a matter of fact, we have," she replied, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "Marshal Parker offered me the deed to a small property just outside town. Seems it was seized from one of Stiles's associates and needs a rightful owner." Ethan raised an eyebrow, surprised. "That's generous of him." "The federal marshal suggested it as part of my compensation for the evidence I provided," she explained. "It's nothing grand, a modest house with a few acres of land, but it's a place to start." "So you've decided to stay in Abilene?" Ethan asked carefully, trying to keep his tone neutral despite the hope rising in his chest. Delilah nodded, her eyes meeting his directly. "I have. Thomas deserves to grow up in a place where his father is remembered as a hero, not just as a victim, and I—" She hesitated. "I've found unexpected connections here." The weight of her words hung between them, full of unspoken meaning. In the week since their arrival, they had spent each day together, taking meals, walking through town, simply talking as Thomas slept. Ethan had shared more of his past than he had with anyone since the war, and Delilah had spoken freely of her life with Robert and her hopes for her son's future. "The property needs work," she continued when Ethan remained silent. "The house is sound, but the barn needs repairs and the fences are practically non-existent." Ethan found himself smiling. "Sounds like you could use a hand." "I could," she agreed softly. "From someone who knows his way around a hammer and saw, someone Thomas and I have come to trust." "Delilah," Ethan began, suddenly aware they were having an important conversation in the middle of Abilene's Main Street. "I don't want to rush you or presume—" "You're not," she interrupted gently. "Ethan, when Robert died, I thought my heart died with him. I never expected to feel." She glanced down at Thomas, gathering her thoughts. "What I'm trying to say is that life can change in an instant. Sometimes terribly, as I learned when I lost Robert. But sometimes wonderfully, unexpectedly, as when a stranger rides out of nowhere and saves you when all hope seems lost." Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. "What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Matthews?" he asked, his voice low and tinged with humor to mask the intensity of his emotions. A blush colored her cheeks. "Nothing scandalous, Mr. Hayes. Simply that I have a property that needs attention, a son who needs a male influence in his life, and a heart that's beginning to heal. If you're interested in being part of that healing process, I would welcome your presence." It wasn't a declaration of love, it was too soon for that, but it was an invitation to possibility, to a future they might build together one day at a time. Ethan found it more meaningful than any passionate avowal could have been. "I believe I am very interested," he replied softly. "Though people might talk." Delilah's smile held a hint of mischief. "Let them. I've faced down outlaws and helped bring down a criminal empire. I think I can handle a few wagging tongues." Thomas chose that moment to reach out, his tiny hand grasping at Ethan's shirt with surprising strength. Both adults laughed, the tension of the moment broken by the baby's innocent intervention. "I think he approves," Ethan said, allowing the child to grip his finger. "He's a good judge of character," Delilah replied warmly. "Like his mother is learning to be." As they sat together on that bench in the heart of Abilene, with Thomas cooing contentedly between them, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging, of rightness. The war and its aftermath had left him adrift, moving from place to place without purpose. Now, looking at Delilah and her son, he could envision roots taking hold, a life built on something more substantial than memories and regrets. It wouldn't be easy. Delilah still carried grief for her husband, and Ethan had his own demons to face. The shadow of Donovan's escape hung over them, a reminder that danger might not be entirely behind them. Building a life together, whatever form that might take, would require patience, understanding, and courage. But as Thomas gripped his finger and Delilah's eyes met his with warmth and promise, Ethan Hayes knew with absolute certainty that it would be worth it. Out of tragedy and danger, something precious had begun to grow, a second chance neither of them had expected, but both were increasingly willing to embrace. "Well then," he said, rising and offering his hand to help her up, "perhaps we should go see this property of yours." "Sounds like we've got work to do." Delilah stood, adjusting Thomas in her arms. "We do indeed, Mr. Hayes. We most certainly do." 2 years later, the property that had once been a rundown parcel on the outskirts of Abilene had transformed into one of the most promising small farms in the county. The house, once weathered and neglected, now stood proudly with fresh paint and new additions, including a nursery for Thomas and the baby girl who had joined their family 4 months earlier. Elizabeth Hayes had her father's green eyes and her mother's determined spirit, evident even in her infant expressions. Her arrival had completed a circle of healing for both Ethan and Delilah, sealing a bond that had grown gradually from respect and friendship into deep, abiding love. They had married in a simple ceremony at the Abilene Church, 14 months after their first meeting, with Thomas, then nearly 2 years old, serving as ring-bearer in the arms of Martha Morgan. Samuel had stood as Ethan's best man, and Marshall Parker had given the bride away, the entire town turning out to celebrate a love story that had become something of a local legend. Victor Donovan had never returned to Kansas, though occasional reports placed him in various territories westward. Harrison Stiles and most of his associates had been convicted and imprisoned, their criminal enterprise dismantled through the combined efforts of federal authorities and local lawmen like Parker. The morning was cool and clear as Ethan mended a section of fence in the north pasture. From this vantage point, he could see the house where Delilah would be preparing breakfast, Thomas playing with his wooden horses on the porch under her watchful eye. Elizabeth would be sleeping in her cradle near the kitchen window, her mother's preferred spot for keeping the baby within sight while she worked. The sound of an approaching horse drew Ethan's attention. He straightened, shading his eyes against the rising sun to identify the rider, Marshall Parker, making his way along the road that connected their farm to town. "Morning, Hayes," Parker called as he drew near. "Got news I thought you'd want to hear right away." Ethan set aside his tools and walked to meet the lawman at the fence line. "Good or bad?" he asked, noting the satisfied expression on Parker's weathered face. "Good, I'd say," Parker replied, dismounting to shake Ethan's hand. "Got a telegram from the federal marshal in Denver yesterday evening. They found Donovan." A tension Ethan hadn't realized he still carried eased from his shoulders. "Alive," Parker shook his head. "Dead. Apparently got himself shot trying to rob a bank in a mining town near Central City. Fitting end, if you ask me." Ethan nodded slowly, processing the news. Donovan's specter had hung over their happiness these past 2 years, not constantly, but present enough in quiet moments of worry when Delilah would glance nervously down the road at an approaching stranger, or when Ethan found himself checking his revolver before bed, despite years of peace. "Thought you and Delilah would sleep better knowing he's no longer out there," Parker said, understanding the significance of the moment. "I appreciate you riding out to tell us," Ethan replied sincerely. Parker remounted his horse. "Give my best to your wife and those fine children of yours. Elizabeth still keeping you up nights?" A smile spread across Ethan's face. "She's got a healthy set of lungs, that's for certain, but we wouldn't have it any other way." After Parker departed, Ethan made his way back to the house. The news about Donovan settled in his mind like the closing of a book. The final loose thread of their ordeal had been tied, the last shadow dispelled. Delilah was at the stove when he entered, the scent of coffee and frying bacon filling the warm kitchen. Thomas sat at the table, carefully setting out plates as he'd been taught, his little face serious with concentration. Elizabeth's soft coos came from her cradle by the window. "You're back early," Delilah observed, turning to greet him with a smile that still quickened his pulse. At 26, she had blossomed from the frightened widow he'd rescued to a confident woman and loving mother, her honey-brown hair caught up in a practical bun, her blue eyes bright with contentment. "Parker rode out," Ethan explained, crossing to the cradle to check on his daughter. Elizabeth gurgled happily at the sight of her father, tiny hands reaching up. He lifted her carefully, marveling as he always did at how something so small could contain so much life. He had news about Donovan. Delilah's hand stilled on the stove. "What news?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "He's dead," Ethan said simply. "Shot during a robbery attempt in Colorado." Thomas looked up, his 4-year-old face serious. "Who's dead, Pa?" Ethan exchanged a glance with Delilah. They had never hidden the truth of their meeting from Thomas, though they had been careful to present it in terms appropriate for a child's understanding. Thomas knew his birth father had been a good man named Robert who had gone to heaven when Thomas was a baby, and that Ethan had helped Thomas and his mother when some bad men chased them. "A man who made poor choices, son," Ethan explained, settling at the table with Elizabeth in his arms. "Someone from the past who can't hurt anyone anymore." Thomas seemed to accept this, returning to his task of arranging forks beside the plates. Delilah brought the skillet to the table, serving bacon onto each plate before returning for the eggs and biscuits. Only when she had completed these tasks and taken her seat did she allow her composure to waver slightly. "So it's truly over," she said softly, reaching across to take Ethan's free hand. "It is," he confirmed, squeezing her fingers gently. They shared a look of profound understanding, acknowledging not just the closing of this final chapter from their past, but the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. From a desperate chase across the Kansas prairie to a family gathered around a breakfast table, their path had been unlikely yet somehow inevitable. "Mama, may I have milk, please?" Thomas asked, breaking the moment with the innocent demands of childhood. Delilah smiled, returning to the present as she poured milk for her son. "Of course, sweetheart, and after breakfast perhaps Papa will take you to see the new foal while I feed Elizabeth. Can I ride him when he gets bigger?" Thomas asked eagerly, his eyes so like Robert's as Delilah had once noted, wide with excitement. "When he's trained and you're a bit older," Ethan promised, adjusting Elizabeth to his shoulder as she began to fuss. "We'll teach you proper, just as I was taught when I was a boy." As they ate together, discussing the simple matters of their day ahead, fences to mend, bread to bake, a trip to town planned for the weekend, Ethan found himself filled with a quiet gratitude that defied expression. The life they had built together was not perfect, no life ever was, but it was rich with love and purpose, healed from past wounds and strengthened by shared challenges. He thought back to that fateful day on the prairie, when he had spurred his horse toward a desperate woman fleeing with her child. He couldn't have known then how completely that moment would alter the course of his life, how a single act of courage would lead to this table, this family, this profound sense of belonging. "What are you thinking about?" Delilah asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Ethan smiled, bouncing Elizabeth gently as she settled against his chest. "Just how sometimes the most important journeys of our lives begin when we least expect them." Delilah's eyes softened with understanding, "and how the hardest roads can lead to the most beautiful destinations." "Exactly that," he agreed, the love between them as tangible as the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Outside, the Kansas wind swept across their land, the same wind that had once carried the sound of pursuit and danger, now bringing only the rustle of ripening wheat and the distant lowing of cattle. The day stretched before them, ordinary yet precious, another page in the story they continued to write together. Far from finished, but already more beautiful than either could have imagined when a cowboy spurred hard and pulled a fleeing mother into his saddle on a desperate afternoon that now seemed a lifetime ago.